You think the wilderness is a place of peace? Think again. Tonight, we're plunging into the deep woods to uncover the most disturbing true camping horror stories ever reported. These aren't campfire tales. These are genuine, terrifying accounts of what happens when you're alone and isolated far from help. From stalkers in the shadows to unexplained, monstrous encounters. These 5 real scary stories will make you rethink your next camping trip. Get ready for a fear you can't shake. Before we start this nightmare, hit that like button to help these chilling tales reach others, and make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on so you never miss another deep dive into true disturbing stories. You go to the woods to get away from people. That's the whole point. You leave the city, the noise, the emails, the pressure of a million eyes you don't know. You drive 5 hours past the last cell tower, down a logging road that rattles your teeth, until you find a spot that is, for all intents and purposes, the definition of gone. That's where I was. Klamath National Forest, so deep in that the only sound was the wind in the high pines and the rush of a creek about a quarter mile away. It was perfect. I set up my camp with the precision of a surgeon. It's a ritual. The tent goes up, stakes driven deep, the sleeping bag unrolled to let it loft. And finally, the kitchen, my little green metal folding table. And it goes the jet boil, the canister of gas, my titanium cup, and the dehydrated meal I'd be eating for dinner. I remember placing my spork right next to the stove. I'm meticulous. Everything has a place. I sat there for hours, just breathing. The sun started to dip, painting the sky in those bruised colors of purple and orange, and that's when I felt it. It wasn't a sound, it was a prickle on my neck. The kind of feeling you get when you're in a crowded subway car and you know someone is staring at you. You can feel the weight of their attention. I turned around. Nothing. Just a sea of trees. An ocean of bark and needles, stretching for 100 miles. I lapped it off. Of course. City nerves, I called it. In the woods, you're not at the top of the food chain. Every sound is a threat until proven otherwise. I was just adjusting. The campfire crackled, a tiny bright bubble of safety in a vast, encroaching darkness. I made my dinner, drank my tea, and stared into the flames. But the feeling didn't leave. It intensified. It felt like the woods weren't empty. They were, holding their breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder. My little green table was there, lit by the firelight. Tent was there. Car was there, but the space between the trees, it felt wrong. It felt full. I told myself it was a mountain lion. A lion will watch you. It will stalk you. But this didn't feel like an animal. An animal has a purpose. Hunger. Territory. This felt patient. It felt curious. Finally, the cold and my own paranoia drove me into my tent. I zipped it up, the sound echoing way too loudly in the silence. I climbed into my bag and turned on my headlamp, pulling out a book. If I couldn't escape the feeling, I'd ignore it. I must have been reading for an hour. The forest was dead quiet. Too quiet. You learn, when you camp, that the night is never silent. There are crickets. There are owls. There are the tiny rustles of mice in the leaf litter. Tonight, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. And then, a thump. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a branch snapping. It wasn't an animal. It was a dull, heavy thump, like setting a piece of firewood on a wooden table. It came from right outside the tent. My heart didn't just jump. It detonated. I stopped breathing. My headlamp was off, and I was frozen in the pitch black, listening. It was so close. Not 15 feet away. At my table. I lay there for, I don't know, an hour, two. I was too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe through my nose. I just waited, waited for the zipper to be torn open, waited for the sound of claws or a knife or whatever it was, but nothing came. The silence returned. This time, it was absolute. A thick, suffocating blanket of nothing. I didn't sleep. Not really. I just drifted in a cold, adrenaline-fueled haze until the first, weak, gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. The light gave me a false courage. I felt foolish. It was a raccoon. It had to be. A big, clumsy raccoon knocked something over. I unzipped the tent. The cold morning air felt like a slap. I crawled out, my legs stiff. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. The fire was a circle of black and gray ash. My cooler was untouched. My pack was leaning against the tree where I'd left it. I walked to the table to make coffee, to boil water, to chase away the night with a hot drink and the promise of day. I stopped. My stove was there. My cup was there. My spork was there. And next to them, placed perfectly in the center of the small green table, was a hat. It was not my hat. It was a baseball cap. But it was old. The color was a faded, indeterminate mud brown. The brim was frayed. The threads hanging loose. It was stained with sweat and God knows what else. There was a logo on the front, but it was so worn and caked with grime that it was just a meaningless shape. My blood didn't just run cold, it evaporated. I stood there, staring at it, and the implications crashed over me one by one. Someone or something had been in my camp. They had been here while I was in the tent, 15 feet away, frozen in fear. The thump I heard, it wasn't something being knocked over. It was this thing being placed. They had walked into my tiny bubble of light and safety. They had stood at my table. They had looked at my things, and then they left a token. A calling card. A trophy? I grabbed my head and spun around, scanning the tree line. The woods were no longer a peaceful sanctuary. They were a wall, 1,000 windows, a million eyes, all fixed on me. I could feel them, watching me, watching my reaction. I didn't make coffee. I moved with a frantic, fumbling terror. I didn't fold my tent. I just ripped the stakes out of the ground and shoved the nylon, poles and all, into the back of my car. I threw my sleeping bag in after it. My pack. The cooler. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys. As I bent to pick them up, my eyes locked on the table. The hat was still there, sitting, patiently. I wanted to grab it, to throw it into the woods, to burn it. But I couldn't. I was terrified to touch it, as if touching it would be an acceptance, acknowledging the contract. I left the table. I left the hat. I got in my car. I locked the door. The sound of the central lock thunking shut was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I started the engine, threw the car in reverse, and sprayed gravel as I spun around. I didn't look back, but as I sped down that logging road, my heart hammering against my ribs, I could not shake a single horrifying thought. It wasn't the threat. A threat is simple. A threat is, get out. This was worse. This was a statement. It was a simple, silent, terrifying message that could only mean one thing. I was here. I saw you. I could have done anything I wanted, and I'll know if you come back. I sold my gear the next week. I've never been camping since. I can't even stand in my own backyard at night without feeling that prickle on my neck. The woods are not empty. They're just quiet, and they're waiting. The subject's name was Elias Vance. He was a cartographer for a small private timber company, though the term was generous. Essentially, he drove out to inaccessible parcels, used GPS to verify boundaries, and then sat in silence for 3 days. His camp was remote, 20 miles past the last serviceable road in the Wenatchee National Forest. He was not a man prone to panic. He understood risk. He carried a satellite phone, a high-caliber sidearm, and a dog named Kilo. Kello was a Rhodesian Ridgeback, a breed developed to hold lions at bay. Kello was Elias's perimeter. If a threat presented itself, Kello would meet it. The incident began at 03,017 hours. Elias was pulled from a deep sleep, not by a noise, but by a lack of one. The subtle, constant ambient noise of a forest at night. The creek rush, the high-frequency tick of crickets, the wind shear, had simply ceased. The auditory environment had gone from a rich, white noise to a flat, dead silence, as though the world's acoustic system had suffered a catastrophic failure. He opened his eyes. The interior of the tent was a landscape of deep indigo, faintly illuminated by a gibbous moon through the thin nylon. Kilo was no longer asleep. The dog was standing in the center of the tent, utterly rigid, oriented toward the west wall. Elias noted the state of the dog. Kilo's back was a continuous ridge of bristled, erect fur, the ridge for which the breed was named. His tail was tucked so tightly that it disappeared entirely. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and punctuated by an intermittent, high-pitched whine of a frequency Elias had never associated with the animal. Kilo was not exhibiting aggression. He was exhibiting a state of maximum fear. Elias reached for the dog, but stopped. He sensed that any movement, any break in the frozen tableau, would be an action of profound consequence. He lay still, his body now flooded with an emergency surge of cortisol and adrenaline. And then, the sound began. It was not a roar or a howl. It was a vibration, a low-frequency, subsonic thrumming that was felt in the chest cavity more than heard in the ear canal. It resonated through the foam sleeping pad and into Elias's skeleton. It was a rhythmic, pulsing sound, like a massive, organic drum operating at the very bottom edge of human hearing. The sound seemed to originate from the area Kilo was staring at, approximately 15 feet outside the tent. This was not the sound of an animal marking territory or communicating. This was the sound of mass, of overwhelming biological weight moving with immense, slow intent. Elias realized that the thrumming was not continuous. It was segmented. It was the sound of a footstep, a profound, heavy displacement of weight. Thud, thud, thud. The entity was circling the tent. Elias watched Kilo's head. The dog's skull pivoted in a slow, precise arc, tracking the sound source as it moved from the west wall across the back of the tent and toward the zipper. Kilo's breathing had devolved into a silent, internal snarl, a low, continuous effort of the throat that produced no sound louder than a strained wheeze. The thudding stopped. The entity was now positioned directly outside the zipper. The silence that followed was an assault. It was worse than the thudding. It suggested intelligence. It suggested waiting. It was then that the secondary sensory input began, the smell. It was an overwhelming, cloying odor that permeated the dense nylon and the tight sleeping bag. It was the smell of oxidized blood and extreme musk, coppery and metallic like an old wet penny, combined with the sickly, sour odor of raw, powerful animal sweat. It was the smell of the abattoir, of a life form built entirely for the consumption of other life forms. It was a primitive, sickening cocktail. Elias's logical mind, despite the horror, began to engage in analysis. The height of the breathing suggested a vertical orientation of no less than 7 feet. The footsteps suggested 2 limbs. The density of the odor suggested extreme biological mass, far exceeding that of a large bear. The entity had to be a bipedal apex predator of impossible scale. A creature that should not exist. A creature that violated every ecological rule. Then, the final, most shattering input. Kilo, the veteran lion hunter, was no longer in a state of defense. He began to back up. Slowly, inch by inch, he retreated, pushing his rigid body against Elias's leg, using his person as a barrier. The dog was not attempting to defend a territory. He was attempting to hide his master. But Kello was no longer making a low-frequency rumble. He was now making a sound that Elias had heard once before, years ago, when the dog was a puppy and had been left alone in the dark for the first time. It was a keening, choked whimper, a sound of utter psychological collapse. And it was then, in the instant, the dog collapsed from defensive posturing to abject terror, that Elias understood the cosmic horror of the moment. The growl, the thrumming, the high-frequency whining. These were not just noises. They were translation. Kilo was not just reacting, he was processing and interpreting something that his primitive, noble brain was not designed to contain. The silence Kilo was reacting to was not a lack of sound. It was the lack of a natural sound. It was the presence of an entity whose natural sound fell outside the spectrum of recognized life. The entity was, to Kilo, a null zone, a creature of absence. And the dog was failing to process the truth. Nothing that size should be this silent. The entity then made its single, deliberate gesture, a scrape, a sound like a rock-hard knuckle or a massive claw being dragged slowly, with intent, down the entire length of the 10th central zipper. The sound implied knowledge. The creature knew the zipper was the entry point. It knew the weakness. It was demonstrating its ability to enter at any moment. But it didn't open it. The scraping stopped. The heavy, metallic breathing returned, and the entity simply stood there. It was a test. It was a demonstration of absolute power. This was not a hungry animal. A hungry animal attacks. This was an intelligence establishing a hierarchy. It was a consciousness observing a lesser life form trapped in a container. Elias's fear left the realm of survival and entered the realm of the existential. This creature was not a threat to his body. It was a threat to his reality. It was a hole in the structure of the known world, a biological impossibility that was patiently waiting for him to make the mistake of acknowledging its presence. He could not scream. He could not move. Every muscle fiber in his body was chemically locked down. He estimated the period of this surveillance at 102 minutes, a duration of sustained terror that should have induced cardiac arrest. At 05 hours, a change occurred. The odor lessened. The breathing stopped. The thrumming did not return. The auditory environment returned. The distant, gentle rush of the creek. And finally, the high, thin chirp of a single songbird. The bird chirped because the sun was rising. Elias remained frozen until the first, thin, pale gray light of pre-dawn made the nylon fabric translucent. He waited until the chirping had escalated into a chorus, validating that the natural acoustic world had returned. He did not unzip the tent. He used the field knife on his belt to slash a 2-foot vertical incision in the side of the nylon, away from the zipper, away from the point of contact. He exited the tent like a man escaping a sinking vessel, frantic and low to the ground. Kilo, still trembling, crawled out after him. The dog's rear legs were locked, rigid from stress. Elias dragged him to the truck. He left the tent, the supplies, the folding table, the cooler, everything behind. He only took the dog and the truck keys. Driving away, Elias did not check his rearview mirror. He was no longer concerned about being pursued. He knew the entity had the capacity to render the laws of physics irrelevant. An aggressive pursuit was unnecessary. The ultimate, terrifying realization was not what the creature was, but why it had spared him. It was not mercy. It was not chance. The creature had allowed him to leave because the demonstration was complete. It had established its intellectual and physical superiority. It had witnessed the complete breakdown of a man and his apex predator companion, and it had cataloged the data. Elias Vance was now a survivor who carried the proof of an impossible life form. The creature had used his fear as a form of communication, a testament to its own existence, that it knew Elias could never rationalize, never share, and never forget. He was the messenger of his own existential collapse. He knew that the forest wasn't empty. It was simply waiting for the next lesson to begin. The silence was merely the creature's preferred method of observation. The growl had been translated. The message was simply, "You are not the top of the food chain, and you are not alone." The map referred to it as St. Jude's Sanctuary. The locals, in the rare instances they spoke of it at all, called it simply the empty church. It was neither a sanctuary nor a church in the modern sense, but a structure. A relic of ash and mortar perched on a granite spur overlooking the valley of the Shenandoah. The man who sought it, Arthur Penn, was a collector of curiosities and a scholar of forgotten theologies. He did not seek God in these ancient places. He sought proof. Proof that belief, when concentrated and left to stagnate, could leave a tangible residue. A kind of spiritual poison. Arthur reached the church at dusk. The approach was agonizing, marked by a barely visible track choked with black briars. The air grew immediately cooler, and the light, already fading, seemed to dim prematurely, as if consumed by the oppressive canopy of old-growth oaks that ringed the small plateau. The building itself was a brutal testament to enduring piety. Constructed of local fieldstone, its form was squat and defiant, without the grace of later Gothic revival. Its windows, tall, narrow lancets, were not stained glass, but thick, wavy panes of yellowed, fractured glass that admitted no light and promised no refuge. The bell tower was the only thing that spoke of elevation, yet the metal bell inside was gone, leaving only the dark, square void of its aperture, a silent, gaping mouth. Arthur parked his sturdy, modern vehicle a quarter-mile down the track, a deliberate gesture to preserve the illusion of solitude. He carried a heavy, oil lamp lantern, its light possessing a color and depth that LED technology could not replicate, and his field notes. The door was massive, made of iron-banded oak, and surprisingly ajar. It was not invitingly open, but stubbornly arrested, having resisted the wind for decades at an angle that allowed only a single man to squeeze through. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the exterior world vanished. The air inside was not cold, but dead. A strange, still atmosphere that seemed to have no measurable humidity or temperature. It felt, Arthur recorded in his mind, like the pressure of ancient things pressing in. The main chamber was simple, a long nave terminating at a raised dais where a crude stone altar stood. The space was choked with dust, a pervasive fine powder that coated everything. The rough-hewn wooden pews, the slate floor, the altar. It was a dust of profound age, not merely the result of neglect, but the residue of time itself. Arthur's lantern cast long, nervous shadows that danced along the exposed support beams of the ceiling. He noted the pervasive sense of a structure that had been scrubbed clean of presence. There was no evidence of vandalism, no signs of modern desecration. The only indication that the building had been purposefully emptied was the methodical removal of every single religious artifact. No cross, no scripture, no candle holder. Only the stone shell remained. He moved slowly down the aisle, his boots crunching not on grit, but on the accumulated layers of that fine, indifferent ash. He reached the altar. It was a monolithic slab, scored and worn by centuries of hands. It was here, at the epicenter of the structure, that the atmosphere changed. A faint, low-frequency sound began to manifest. It was not a growl, but a hum, a sound that could be interpreted as the deep vibration of the building settling, or something far more unsettling. It was precisely the sound of a sustained, low G chord played on an impossibly heavy instrument. Arthur dismissed the immediate psychological implications. Subsonics in the structure, he noted. Old wood and mortar reacting to temperature drop. He set his lantern down on the altar and began to examine the stone surface. Here, the layer of dust was thinner, disturbed by some earlier presence, and carved into the face of the altar, not by tools, but by repeated, frantic scratching, were the words, "He speaks only silence." The inscription was crude, almost violent, clearly the last testament of someone in a state of extreme distress. It spoke of a profound disillusionment, or perhaps a terrifying revelation. Arthur pulled a glove from his pocket and ran a finger over the scratch marks. They were recent, not decades, but perhaps a year or two. He looked up, across the empty, dusty pews, and suddenly, the vastness of the space felt less empty and more cleared. He turned his attention to the chancel. Behind the altar, a small, dark doorway led into what would have been the sacristy or vestry. This space was smaller, darker, and its air was colder, possessing a damp, soil-like odor. As he entered the small room, the humming of the main nave stopped. The sudden absence of the low thrum was more terrifying than its presence. The stillness returned, heavier and more absolute than before. In the center of the sacristy stood a pedestal of rough stone, and on the pedestal, covered in a thin, sheer layer of the omnipresent ash, was an object. It was a small, desiccated book. Arthur approached the pedestal. The book was bound in what appeared to be human leather thick, pale, and deeply scored. Its pages, stiff with age and some kind of dried residue, were slightly splayed open. He did not touch it. His scholarly instinct told him that this was the core of the spiritual poison he sought. He lowered the lantern to illuminate the open pages. The script was an archaic Latin, cramped and desperate. He translated the passage in his mind, slowly. And the first sin of this place was not pride, but silence. They built their house upon the knowledge that the world did not speak back. And so the Lord of Silence came to fill the void, taking their voices first and then their hearing, leaving them only the echo of the prayers they had already offered. And their stone hands grew heavy with ash, for they knew no way to confess, nor to plead, nor to cry out. Arthur stepped back, his academic composure cracking. This was not theological allegory. This was a terrible, personalized record. The language implied a contagion, a creeping curse rooted in the simple fact of the valley's solitude. He realized the true meaning of the church's emptiness. The congregation had not abandoned the building. The silence had consumed them. He backed out of the sacristy, his eyes fixed on the book. He understood now why the door was ajar. It was the final, failed attempt of the last terrified man to escape the encroaching silence. As he re-entered the nave, he swept the lantern across the pews. He stopped. He was certain, absolutely certain, that when he had first entered, the dust on the pews was undisturbed. Now, on the fifth pew from the altar, there was a smudge, a clear, deep indentation in the ash, perfectly shaped like the print of a human hand. It was large, and it was fresh. The terrifying implication was instantaneous. The silence had not killed the residents, it had merely replaced them, and the replacements were now aware of his presence. He retreated toward the entrance, moving faster now. His pace quickened, but the heavy dust seemed to absorb his momentum, making the exit an agonizing crawl. The entrance was 20 yards away, and it seemed to recede with every step. He reached the heavy oak door. His hands, now shaking violently, seized the iron band, and he began to pull. The door groaned, dragging across the slate floor with a sound that felt deafening in the stillness. As the small gap widened, offering a sliver of the indigo night sky, Arthur saw it. It was standing on the altar where he had placed his lantern. Not the lantern, but the shape of a person. It was a man, or the terrifying impression of one, composed entirely of the fine, gray ash that covered the floor. It was a perfectly formed, full-scale human figure, standing motionless on the dais. Its surface was porous, shifting, and profoundly, impossibly silent. It had not walked there. It had simply coalesced. And then the figure moved. It raised an arm, and the movement was not a gesture, but a subtle shift in its powdery mass. The arm was directed not at Arthur, but at the stone altar. With slow, terrifying precision, the figure of ash began to scratch at the altar's surface. Just above the first inscription, Arthur wrenched the door open fully and scrambled out, falling to his knees on the damp ground. He did not look back. He dragged himself away from the threshold, crawling on all fours toward the tree line. He could still hear the sound, not the thrumming, not a voice, but the faint, dry, frantic sound of grit scratching stone, a sound of desperate, permanent communication. He reached the cover of the oaks, hiding behind the trunk of the massive tree. He waited, shivering, until the scratching ceased. It did not cease. It continued. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was slower now. More deliberate. The sound was not coming from the church door. It was coming from the wood of the tree he was hiding behind. Arthur looked down. On the rough, dark bark, where he had rested his hand, a new message was being written. He didn't see the writer. He only saw the ash. The fine gray dust was pooling under his fingernails and spreading, creating the single, sharp outline of a letter. It was the letter A. The scratching was on the tree, coming from his own proximity, his own ash-covered hand as it rested on the bark. The ash had found him. He was the next medium. He screamed, a dry, choked sound that the silent valley immediately swallowed whole. He ran, a desperate, blind scramble through the woods, leaving his vehicle, his notes, and his sanity behind. He never returned. He never returned, but in the years that followed, people who knew him noted a terrifying habit. Arthur penned compulsively, constantly, and violently scrubbed his hands. They were raw, bleeding, infected. He was trying to remove the relic of ash, the proof that the silence had not only consumed the church, but had claimed him as its next vessel. The lesson of the church was not that the world did not speak back. The lesson was that when the world goes silent, the only voice left is the one that tells you exactly where you went wrong. The water was the reason he chose the spot. Mark had hiked 4 days into the Olympic wilderness, seeking the headwaters of a stream noted on old forestry maps, a spring rumored to be the purest in the region. He called it the Silver Vein, and when he finally located the source, he knew the effort had been justified. The water did not rush. It flowed, a thick, silent current emerging from a deep, moss-lined fissure in the granite. It tasted not merely of clean water, but of distance and cold antiquity, like melted, frozen starlight. Mark drank deeply, filling his flask and his hydration reservoir. It was perfect. He set up his camp 50 feet from the stream bank. For the first 2 days, the solitude was restorative. He spent his time observing the slow-motion life of the rainforest, the monumental scale of the Douglas firs, the thick, spongy carpet of emerald moss, the air so heavy with moisture it felt like breathable velvet. He felt profoundly well, cleansed by the environment and invigorated by the silver water, which he drank exclusively. It was on the third morning that the whisper began. It wasn't auditory in the conventional sense. It did not come from the air. It came from within. It was a faint, high-frequency fizzing sensation in the deep structures of his ears, like the distant sound of static or grains of sand being poured onto silk. It was not a language, it was a sensation of language. He woke with a headache, not a throbbing pain, but a deep central ache that sat behind the orbits of his eyes. His movements were slow. He attributed it to the deep sleep and the radical change in altitude. He drank a pint of the stream water. The water, usually so smooth and cool, felt strangely heavy on his tongue, almost viscous. The whisper intensified for a moment, then subsided into a low internal hum. By midday, the physiological changes began their inevitable progression. First, the thirst. It was not the parched, dehydrated thirst of exertion, but a deep, structural demand for liquid. He drank constantly, filling his bladder every hour, yet the thirst never receded. It grew into an agonizing, pervasive ache that settled in his bones. The water, no matter how much he consumed, seemed to bypass his body systems entirely, satisfying nothing. Then, the skin. Mark noticed a strange, heightened sensitivity. The soft flannel of his shirt felt like coarse, rough wool. The light from his headlamp, which he wore constantly, seemed to sear his retinas. When he touched his own cheek, the familiar texture of his skin felt alien, brittle, and thin, like old parchment stretched over bone. He ate a dehydrated meal, pasta primavera. But the act of chewing required immense effort. The food felt like tasteless pulp, and his tongue seemed to resist any effort to swallow. The whisper had now stabilized into a constant, low-grade drone. It was just below the threshold of comprehension, a relentless, irritating sound that seemed to be vibrating the marrow of his skull. On the fourth day, the true horror of the infection began to manifest itself in the eyes. Mark looked into the small, curved mirror of his survival kit. His eyes were not merely bloodshot. The whites were shot through with a dense, fine network of crimson threads, like river deltas seen from a great height. He looked tired, but the darkness under his eyes was not shadow. It was a subtle, gray-blue discoloration, an infiltration of the surface tissue. He realized his pupils were unnaturally large, dilated to black pools that consumed his irises. His vision was sharper, profoundly so. He could count the microscopic barbs on the feathers of a crow perched 60 yards away. This hyperacuity was not a blessing. It was a curse. His vision was now overstimulated, too sensitive to the subtle variations in light and shadow. He returned to the stream bank, his thoughts now spiraling into manic paranoia. He examined the water source, the silver vein. It was unchanged, flowing with the same chilling clarity. But as he looked down into the fissure, he saw something he had missed before, a faint, iridescent sheen on the surface of the water, like oil. And within the water, something was moving, not fish. These were thin, crystalline filaments, transparent and microscopic, visible only due to his unnaturally enhanced vision. They were moving against the current, climbing out of the fissure. The whisper in his head abruptly shifted. It was no longer static. It was rhythm, a faint, steady tick-tick-tick-tick, the sound of a multitude of tiny feet moving across a hard surface. He fell back, landing hard on the moss. The pain was immediate, acute, and localized in the small of his back. He ripped his shirt up to examine the point of impact. The skin was already reacting. A single small pustule had formed where his back had hit the ground. It was taut, clear, and filled with a thick, silver-colored liquid. Mark understood with chilling clarity. The water was not merely contaminated, it was alive. It was a medium for a parasitic life form that was now establishing a symbiotic relationship with his central nervous system, consuming his body's resources and gifting him with sensory overload. The whisper was the sound of the parasite colonizing his inner ear. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. His vocal cords, he noted with detached horror, felt stiff, resistant to the effort. The only remaining recourse was flight. He had to get to his satellite phone 5 miles back on the trail. He began to pack his gear, but his movements were a pathetic parody of efficiency. His fingers trembled, and the smooth aluminum surface of his cooking pot felt like razor wire in his grip. His coordination was dissolving. As he struggled to collapse his tent poles, he saw the final, terrifying symptom of the infection. The vegetation, the moss. The thick, vibrant moss that covered the ground, the trees, and the rocks was beginning to move. Not violently, but with the subtle, slow, undeniable growth of tendrils seeking new purchase. Where the silver water had spilled near his camp, the moss was actively reaching. It had extended, in the space of 1 hour, by nearly a full inch, growing thicker, wetter, and more metallic blue in color. And where his feet had rested on the trail, the moss had begun to sprout, strange, silver-tipped spores, tiny and dense, waiting to be disturbed. He realized the water was not simply a host, it was a propagator. It was spreading its unique biome through him and into the forest, using his body as a mobile incubator and dispenser. He grabbed his pack, a desperate gesture given his condition, and stumbled toward the trail. The sun was setting, and the deep gloom of the forest was magnified tenfold by his now hypersensitive pupils. The whisper was now a roar. It had crystallized into a single, insistent, and terrifying sentence in the center of his mind, not in English, not in any known human tongue, but in a language of pure pressure and vibration. You are our river. Why are our vessel? Go. He ran. He ran. He ran with a desperate, jerky pace, driven not by his own will, but by the relentless, commanding force in his skull. But his speed was deceptive. His body was failing. His joints, his knees, his hips began to lock up, resisting the strain. The simple act of locomotion had become agonizingly difficult. He collapsed against a large cedar tree. He leaned his head back, panting, the silver-blue light of the moon filtering through the high canopy. He felt something crawling on his neck. He reached up. His fingers closed around something hard, thick, and segmented. He crushed it instinctively. When he pulled his hand away, it was covered in a thick, metallic sap and 2 tiny, perfect silver exoskeletons. The filaments in the water were not merely spores. They were larvae. They had been consuming the moisture in his body and building a structure. He looked down at his arms. In the moonlight, the veins beneath his skin were not blue. They were a faint, luminous silver. The parasite had replaced his blood. He was no longer Mark. He was a biological conduit, a river of silver life moving through the forest. He began to scream, but only a dry, rattling hiss emerged from his throat. His vocal cords were now too stiff to produce human speech. He stumbled on, a grotesque, silent machine driven by the command in his head. Go. Propagate. Spread the vein. He finally reached the end of the trail, the place where he had hidden his phone and GPS. It was a clear, small space by an old rock bed. He fell to his knees. The first drop of water ran out of his left eye. Not tears, but a thick, viscous, silver fluid, replacing the moisture that had kept his optic nerve functional. He had become a weeping spring. He reached the satellite phone. His fingers, now feeling like petrified wood, struggled to press the buttons. He managed to power it on. He stared at the screen. the numbers blurring through the silver film over his eyes. He tried to call out, to issue a warning, to give his coordinates. But the whisper, the river's command, was absolute. His mouth opened, but the sound that emerged was not a plea for rescue. It was a deep, guttural, rhythmic gurgle. The terrifying sound of water rushing through a narrow pipe, a sound of consumption and propagation. It was the sound of the stream finally speaking. He was found 3 days later, 5 miles from the stream. He was still alive, his body horribly calcified, his skin a mottled gray-blue. He was not wearing his pack. He was simply digging. He was using his broken, blistered fingers to dig a shallow trench leading away from his own eyes, attempting to create a new tributary in the soil. The forest had not just killed him, it had adopted him. He was no longer a man. He was a relic of ash and water, forever bound to the silver vein. It started simply. It started with the fire. It was a perfect night, that first night. The first night. It was the only night. It was the only night I can trust. I had hiked 7 hours off trail, deep into the Uinta Wasatch. I pitched my tent on a ridge, flat granite, overlooking a massive, silent valley. The air was alpine and clean. The stars, you could see the stars, billions of them, more than I'd ever seen. I built the fire. A clean, crackling snap of pine and cedar. I got my water boiling. I wrote the date in my journal, August 14th, the only date, the only thing I can trust. I was stirring my instant coffee, watching the steam curl away into the dark, when the pause happened. It wasn't a sudden stop. It was a hiccup in reality. The flame of the fire, which had been dancing, just held. The steam stopped curling. It hung in a perfect frozen plume, translucent and still, exactly 2 inches above the pot rim. My heart did not stop. It skipped a beat, a physical, painful skip. And then reality snapped back. The fire flared. The steam lifted. The wind whispered down the slope. I told myself it was altitude sickness, a micro-sleep, a localized seizure. I told myself a lot of things. I drank the coffee. It tasted metallic. I forced myself to read a chapter of my book. I went to sleep. I woke up cold and wet. My tent zipper was open. I was lying in my sleeping bag, and the rain fly was pulled back, exposing the dew-drenched fabric of the inner mesh. I was shivering, not from the temperature, but from that deep, bone-gnawing chill of wrongness. I sat up. The sun was coming up. Dawn. It was always dawn. I looked at the fire pit. The fire was roaring, not smoldering, not banked, but roaring, a tall, clean column of flame, exactly as I had built it the night before. But the wood was gone. There were no unburnt logs, just the embers glowing furiously hot. It was a fire that consumed its fuel but didn't diminish. I checked my journal. August 14th. The pen strokes were fresh. The ink was still dark. I was confused, but not scared yet. Just disoriented. I must have slept through the night. The fire was just a good fire. I checked the coffee. The coffee pot was sitting on the granite. It was boiling. Not cooling, not empty, but boiling. The water roiling and spitting steam. But I hadn't refilled it. I hadn't put it on the heat. I stood up. My pack was leaning against the tent. I saw the flask tucked into the side pocket. I reached for it, and I saw the stick. It was a perfect piece of kindling, a pencil-thin stick of dry pine. It was balanced delicately on the corner of the tent's vestibule zipper, and etched into the bark, freshly scored, were 4 vertical lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. I recognized the stick. I had carried it for 3 days. It was my lucky kindling. I looked at the fire. The fire was roaring. I looked at my journal. August 14th. I drank the boiling coffee. I packed my gear. I hiked out. I hiked for 12 hours, fast and panicked, until I hit the trailhead. I drove for 6 hours, straight to my apartment. I locked the door. I threw the tent, the pack, the boots, everything into the dumpster. I showered until my skin was raw. I didn't camp for a year. I got rid of my gear. I even bought a different journal. But the 0 point. That's what I call it now. The point where time collapses. It doesn't care about your gear. It only cares about the loop. Last week, I cracked. I booked a flight. I needed to see the stars again. I needed to prove that the Uintas were just a place, not a trap. I flew back. I rented a new Jeep. I bought new gear. I drove to the exact same trailhead. I hiked the exact same 7 hours. I found the ridge, the flat granite. I pitched my tent. It was a perfect night. I built the fire, a clean, crackling snap of pine and cedar. I got my water boiling. I pulled out my new journal. I wrote the date, August 14th. And then the pause happened. The fire held. The steam froze. The wind died. This time, I didn't move. I didn't blink. I waited. It lasted longer. Not a skip. A stretch. I felt my heart beat thump. And then silence. I held the beat. I held the tension. I held the fear. And then reality snapped back. The fire flared. The steam lifted. The wind whispered. I looked at the fire. It was roaring. I looked at the coffee. It was boiling. I looked at the stick in the vestibule zipper. 4 vertical lines. I grabbed the stick. It was my stick. The lucky kindling. The bark was freshly scored. 1, 2, 3, 4. I threw it into the fire. It vanished instantly, consumed. I grabbed the journal. I stared at the date, August 14th. I ripped the page out. I crumpled it. I threw it in the fire. I grabbed the coffee pot. I poured the boiling water straight onto the granite. Hiss. Steam. I got the hell out of the tent. I started packing the entire campsite. Fast. I wasn't going to wait for dawn. I was leaving in the pitch black. I got the stakes out. I rolled up the sleeping pad. I packed the food bag. I looked at my hand, the hand holding the tent pole. On the skin, the delicate skin between my thumb and forefinger, were 4 red scratches. Fresh, thin, stinging. 1, 2, 3, 4. I didn't do that. I never scratched myself. I looked back at the fire pit. The fire was roaring. The water pot was boiling. The tent was packed. My pack was ready. But wait. I saw the tent pole in my hand. It was unpacked. It was still folded, leaning against the tent sack. I looked at the tent sack. It was fully packed, zip tight. I looked at the tent. It was pitched. The rainfly was back. The mesh was exposed. The loop had tightened. I stood between 2 versions of reality. The one where I had packed the tent, and the one where the tent was still standing. I was holding the packed pole, looking at the standing tent. I checked my journal, the new, different journal. I had left it on a rock. I reached for it. The page was open. I had written the date, August 14th. And under the date, something had written, "The fire is perfect." The handwriting was mine, but the pen was not mine. It was a black, cheap ballpoint. I only carry a mechanical pencil. I dropped the journal. I looked at the coffee pot. It was boiling. I picked it up. I hurled it across the granite ridge. It bounced once, twice, and clanged against a rock. I turned back to the tent. The tent was standing. I saw my pack. It was leaning against the tent. I heard the hiss behind me. I looked. The coffee pot was sitting on the granite. It was boiling. It hadn't moved. It was back on the heat source I hadn't built. I looked at the rock where I had thrown the pot. There was a faint, black skid mark on the granite. The memory was real. The action was real. But the object was restored. The loop restores. I understood. The loop doesn't reset me. It resets the environment. It is forcing me to repeat the same 12-hour sequence from fire building to dawn over and over until I break. I was the only variable. The only thing that carried the scars. I had to escape the 0 point before dawn. Before the final reset. I grabbed my pack, the one that had been packed, then unpacked, then packed again. I ripped it open. I pulled out my satellite phone. I needed to call out. I needed a witness. I hit the power button. The screen glowed. I saw the time. 3017 a.m. The time of the pause. I stared at the screen. I saw the GPS coordinates. They were correct. And then I saw the date. The date on the satellite phone's display read August 14th, 2025. I dropped the phone. The phone was wrong. It was August 14th, 2024. Or 2023. Or 2022. It didn't matter. It was always August 14th, but the year was wrong. The loop was moving forward in time, but restoring me to the past. I was traveling through time, but always arriving at the same 12 hours. I was living the same day, 1 year later, forever. I ran. I ran down the slope, scrambling over the granite. I ran toward the valley, toward the distant, invisible road. I ran for maybe 10 minutes. My lungs burned. My knees screamed. I hit the valley floor. I looked up. I saw the ridge, the flat granite, and I saw the fire. The fire was roaring. I looked down at my feet. I was standing in the middle of my campsite. My tent was pitched. My pack was leaning against it. The coffee pot was boiling. The loop had been faster than I was. It had pulled me back. I hadn't run down the slope. I had run in a circle of collapsing space. I walked back to the tent. I walked back to the fire. I was exhausted. I was defeated. I picked up the stick from the vestibule zipper. I looked at the 4 scores. 4 loops. I broke the stick in half. I put the 2 halves back on the zipper. I picked up a rock. I smashed the coffee pot. I smashed the flask. I smashed the lantern. I smashed my pencil. I waited for the reset. I waited for the pop, the snap, the hiss of reality stitching itself back together. Nothing. The broken shards of the coffee pot remained scattered on the granite. The stick remained broken. The tent remained pitched. The fire, however, was roaring. It had never stopped. I looked at my hand. The 4 red scratches were gone. My skin was clean. I had been restored, but the objects had been spared. I reached for the journal. The new journal. The page was open. August 14th. The pen marks were fresh. And under the line, "The fire is perfect," the black ballpoint had added, "You cannot break the scene." And then, under that, another line, scratched deeply into the paper, "You can only break the self." I dropped the journal. The final, terrifying realization hit me. I was not being punished. I was being preserved. Preserved in this single, perfect, terror-filled moment. The loop was designed to protect the scene of its creation, and I, the sole witness, was the keeper of the memory. I walked to the fire. I stared into the furious hot center of the perpetual flame. I looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to fade. Dawn was coming. The moment of reset. I felt the cold, That internal, bone-gnawing cold. I knew what came next. The full reset. The cold, wet awakening. The return to the perfect fire. The boiling coffee. And the terrifying belief that it was only the first night. I reached into the fire. I pulled out a single, glowing ember. I pressed it against my palm. The pain was immediate, absolute, and real. The flesh shrieked. It was the deepest, most final proof of my own reality. I screamed, a full, glorious human scream of pain and defiance. And then I felt the pause. The fire froze. The embers stopped glowing. My scream was cut short, frozen on my lips. My pain was suspended. I saw the star I had been watching all night. A tiny blue speck directly overhead. It held perfectly still. I held the searing ember in my palm, and I waited for the final, clean, surgical reset. But this time, I knew. It wouldn't erase the burn. It would only erase the cause. I would wake up cold and wet, with a perfectly formed, agonizing blister on my palm, with no memory of how it got there. I would wake up cold. And I would build the perfect fire, and I would see the stick. And I would write the date, and the loop would begin again. I was the 0 point. I was the sacrifice. I was the memory bank of a moment that refused to die. The loop clicked. I woke up cold and wet. The tent zipper was open. The sun was coming up. Dawn. I sat up. I looked at my palm. A massive, perfect white and red blister. A permanent scar. I looked at the fire pit. The fire was roaring. I checked the journal. August 14th, I picked up the stick. It was a perfect piece of kindling, pencil thin. Etched into the bark were 5 vertical lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The loop had begun again,